right. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, if you give Dr. Hassan a round of applause, I know you guys like it. So my name is Bryson White, originally from Fresno, here from Fresno, California, born and raised. How many folks here from Fresno, by the way, just a quick? Put your hands up if you're from Fresno. Okay, yeah. The majority of other folks are from the Central Valley or Los Angeles, the Bay Area. Los Angeles, raise your hand.
Los Angeles.
Okay, Bay Area. All right, so different parts of California. All right. So yeah, so I'm from Fresno. Went to Bullard High School. Then I went to Fresno City College. Played ball there for a little bit. Then I went to Cal State Northridge. So I'm a part of the CSU system as well. Did a major in political science and a minor in English literature. Then I went to seminary for graduate school and received a master's in theology and a master's in cross-cultural studies. And so I'm really, from an academic standpoint, just really interested in the intersection of religion and political life. So how do our religious dispositions affect how we end up being involved politically and how we understand public policy and things of that nature. And so I'm a part of an organization called Faith and Community, which is a local organization. It's a part of a larger national network called PICO National Network, which stands for People Improving Communities Through Organizing. And we do faith-based community organizing across the country. And so really, we're at PICO's in 32 states and about 150 cities. And here locally, Faith and Community represents up to 20 congregations and 10,000 families. So we work on a whole variety of issues, but really the goal of Faith and Community is to put human dignity at the center of public life, right? So we want our public policies to reflect our faith values and our ethical values and our democratic values as a society, so our policies are of equal treatment. How many of us know in here that public policy, not just in Fresno, but in the country, is not something that has human dignity at the center of public life? Do we realize that we live in a society that our policies really disproportionately affect people of color, people in low-income communities of all ethnic backgrounds as well. And so our organization is a multi-ethnic organization. It's an interfaith organization that seeks to connect people of faith and good conscience to issues of justice in the city. By the way, black was like the wrong color to wear today. I think it's like super hot outside. I think it's like laundry day at the crib or something. I guess I'll just dive into talking about Ferguson and my experience.
And how did that whole trip come up? Because y'all didn't tell me nothing, man. I would have been on the plane. I didn't know anything.
So the organization I work for, PICO, they hit the ground really early in the protests that were taking place in Ferguson, Missouri. And so there's a couple key clergy and directors across our network from Philadelphia and the Bay Area and other places who were the first people on the ground to really be a part of the protest with the young people of Ferguson. The reason we ended up in Ferguson was they basically put a call out to us and to the whole network, and they said essentially that they need organizers and they need clergy to come for some of the activities that PICO was doing in Ferguson on the ground. And so myself, Pastor DJ Klein of the St. Louis Missionary Baptist Church, and Pastor B.T. Lewis of Rising Star, we went out there to join and support with fellow clergy and organizers on the ground. And so when we got there, there were several things that we did. And so I'll share some of our experiences, but I think more important than our experience is the analysis of what was happening in Ferguson, what continues to happen. And so when we got there, we participated in a march to a city called Clayton, right? So we marched to the Justice Center in a city called Clayton. And the reason we did that is because the St. Louis County prosecutor is in the city of Clayton in the building in the Justice Center. And so we came they put a call out for a lot of clergy. There's about 300 clergy who came from across the country, and we basically put a list of demands in front of the St. Louis County prosecutor, and namely the main demand was for him to recuse himself from the case, for him to excuse himself from the case, because in his 20 years on the job, he's never prosecuted a police officer for deadly force. And the reason he hasn't prosecuted a police officer for deadly force is because his own father was a law enforcement officer in the 1960s who was killed by an African-American man. So needless to say, he has some conflicts of interest when it comes to prosecuting particularly white police officers who are gunning down black people in cities. So we had a list of demands. So, but a key piece, not even just the list of demands, what was powerful about that particular stretch of our engagement was that we weren't walking, so mind you, we hadn't been to Ferguson yet, so we weren't protesting in an area where the police are typically harassing people. We took that particular protest to an area of the city that is really upper class and it was predominantly white. And so while we're protesting in this particular area, multi-ethnic, interfaith group of people, it was a powerful piece because we realized that we made that particular situation, we made people feel uncomfortable. And that's what we wanted to do. And we didn't want to make people feel uncomfortable just so they can feel uncomfortable, but we wanted to bring the reality of what's happening, not just in Ferguson, but to the entire country, to an area of St. Louis that typically doesn't have to grapple with these particular issues, right? And so we didn't get a lot of honks, you know what I mean? We didn't get a lot of, you know, good job kind of stuff. We got a lot of mean stares. There was a lot of law enforcement that was even lining up this particular section of where we were in Clayton. Law enforcement's disposition towards us was very unfriendly. And this is, and we arrived, this all happened about 2 days, I think, after the last incident of tear gassing and rubber bullets, right? And the area that we're in this time isn't where that stuff happened, but there was these negative dispositions of law enforcement towards clergy. People have been arrested in that particular area the previous days before for trying to get into the justice and things of that nature. All right, so then, so later that night, after we had the rally, it was a powerful rally. Not only because what clergy were saying, but more importantly, what some of the young people who were there from St. Louis were saying about Ferguson, about the area of St. Louis as a whole. So after that, we got in our car and we drove to Ferguson, and it started storming and raining, which I was really excited about because I hadn't seen rain in like 5 years. You know what I'm saying? So the other folks in the car were like, man, we hope it doesn't rain out there. I'm like, I hope it rains out there. You know what I mean? Because I haven't felt it in a while. But so we went to a church called St. Mark. And St. Mark was critical in this particular protest movement because St. Mark is where a lot of the young people and activists were staging before they went and hit the streets in Ferguson. And that same church, St. Mark, was raided by the police department just 2 days prior to our arrival, right? You know, so the police department had raided this church that was housing young people and nonviolent protesters, went in, was going through everybody's bags, rummaging through everybody's bags, saying that there wasn't a permit for them to have these folks here, but it wasn't the permit they cared about. It was trying to disrupt the protest that was taking place. And they were accusing people of having weapons, but no weapons at all were found on the premises. And all they found really were snacks and milk and magnesia. Right, and so milk and magnesia, we'll get to that more in a second, but that's what you spray on your eyes if you get tear gas. So these young folks had milk and magnesia in their bags because of what they were up against and what they knew that they were going to confront during the protest in Ferguson. So we received basically instructions from people who had been on the ground and who had been organizing. Anybody heard of the Dream Defenders in the room? Philip Agnew, the Dream Defenders out of Florida, they emerged out of the Trayvon Martin protest. Well, the Dream Defenders were there, Organization for Black Struggle. There are various organizations that were here at this church before we went out to this protest. And so when we went to the protest was an experience like no other for a lot of different reasons. But the two main reasons are, one, the overwhelming presence of military force and the resilience of the young people of Ferguson and the protesters who came in. And so when we got to the protest, we had been briefed essentially that, that each situation that happened in Ferguson was never initiated by the young people when it came to the violent outbursts, right? So contrary to the media, what the media was saying, the folks who were on the ground, before I even got out there, had briefed us on who it was that was initiating the violence, and each time it was the law enforcement that was shooting the tear gas and the bullets unprompted by nonviolent protesters. So even though there were clashes, those clashes began because of the aggressiveness of law enforcement. We got that word from the folks who had been tear gassed themselves and shot with rubber bullets, right? So when we got into, there's a strip, so it's really interesting, man, because Ferguson, like the way it was depicted, you think that like the protest strip was this really big area, but it really wasn't. It was probably just from, I don't know, the library to this parking lot, maybe, at most, right? And so the way they set it up is when you arrive, you have to park really far away. So they're trying to limit the amount of people who were coming into the protest. So they made you park far away, they blocked off side streets. And then so when you get there, you have to walk really far. And so when we were walking, the first thing that we noticed, there's two things. One, they had law enforcement in the middle of the street, and they were basically slowing down cars and making people divert their direction. But then, like immediately when you pass this, and this is well before you even see or hear the protesters, you see this overwhelming presence of military force. Tanks, right? National Guard, M16s, lining the street. It was something like out of a movie. It really felt like we were no longer, it's like we entered into the space that was no longer the United States and entered into a foreign country that was occupied by a foreign ruler, right? So it was very strange. And so that atmosphere was just set. So the closer you get to the protest, the more you hear the protest, and the more you start seeing the presence of law enforcement. So during the protest, which we were there was not even any violent interaction between, physically violent interaction between law enforcement and its residents. But so basically how it was set up, people walked around basically like a circuit because the police and the National Guard wouldn't allow you to peacefully assemble wherever you wanted. They basically were violating everyone's rights and forcing them to walk around in a circuit, right? And so they're trying to tire everybody out, so people got tired of protesting is what they were trying to do, right? And so so people were, I can't overstate this. The amount of law enforcement is something like I've never seen and hopefully we'll never have to see again. They lined the streets up. It almost seemed like a one-to-one correlation between law enforcement and protesters. There were hundreds of protesters, and they were completely unfriendly. They were crude, even if you tried to speak to them and be friendly, they weren't trying to be friendly with you. I noticed some of our pastors, Pastor Lewis, tried to shake the law enforcement officer's hand. They didn't want to shake his hand. The director of Social Justice for Sojourners, a social justice organization in D.C. who was walking with us, they wouldn't speak with her when she was trying to be cordial with them. Right? So some clergy were trying to break tensions, and it just wasn't happening in some aspect. So the police were crude, making you walk this circuit, but the circuit was pretty powerful because it was the young people who were really leading these protests. And I think that was something that was really phenomenal. The young folks were saying something that really has stuck with me. They were saying, we're young, we're strong, and we're marching all night long, right? So folks your age and younger were walking. And that was a powerful piece because to me what they were saying is, in the face of domination and violence and this oppressive force, they were appealing to their youth and their vitality, saying that we're going to outlast this dominating force, right? And that's really powerful because in that space, you have a contest of power, right? You have a contest of American military dominance, right? And the dominance that America uses in terms of violence to suppress protests, in which they've done throughout history. And then you had the contest of nonviolence. So it was the people who were operating in nonviolent ways. So in this space in Ferguson, you had two contesting and competing voices really saying what kind of country we are. It was two different competing voices describing what America is. You had one voice that was saying that we appeal to America's dominance and violence, and you had another force that was saying we appeal to America's democratic traditions and the ability to peacefully assemble and to protest. And that's really where the space of conflict is. And so it was deep to see because within that you see a microcosm of the country as a whole. Does that make sense? You see a microcosm of the country as a whole. and the fight that's really not only has historically taken place, but the fight that's really reemerging in this nation around what kind of nation are we going to be, right? So that's always been a question of what kind of nation are we going to be? And we've been, there's been different intervals in our history where we've tried to rectify things that were right, but the forces of domination and violence emerged to suppress those things. And so Ferguson was a microcosm of this American history and of things to come, because there is a movement that's gathering across this country, and that contest between the forces of power and dominance and peace and nonviolence are going to clash once again. And so Ferguson was a representation of that. So we walked, for a long period of time, and then and we went home at like 2:30 in the morning. And it was there's so much to say about it. For the sake of time, I'll spare you all the descriptive details about that particular march and ask for questions before I go on to the next part in which I want to kind of talk about. So any brief questions or comments about some of the things that I described or some of the things that I saw?
How did you deal with the fear? I know you had to be afraid.
Yeah, you know what? So I'll tell you when I was afraid. I was afraid when I first came to St. Louis. I went into a room, right? And it was with clergy who hadn't been there on the ground, right? Folks had gas masks from the tear gas. And Reverend Alvin Herring, who's the national director of PICO's training, who had been really courting a lot of the forces on the ground, was telling us what they've experienced in the last few days. So he was talking about when we get out there, how there's going to be disorienting sounds, because law enforcement was sending off these disorienting sounds to disorient people. How there's going to be tear gas, there's going to be violence from law enforcement in the sense of their presence and domination, and how they're going to try to instill fear. But it was the way he was describing it. Honestly, it was the way he was describing it. I felt like I went back in time into the 60s. And I was like, dang, this is what these sisters and brothers were up against on a day-to-day basis in the Jim Crow South and the segregated North and West. But then when the movement really jumped off, this is what they were up against, right? And so none of us had died in this space, right? And so it gave me just another deeper, profound respect. It just continues to deepen that respect for the tradition of protest, particularly in the black community in this country, because when we were protesting, folks were getting murdered. You know what I mean? And so it gave me a sense of how much this moment matters. You know? And so that was the moment I was kind of afraid. You know what I mean? But I wasn't afraid in terms of I wasn't captivated by my fear, right? I was like, nah, it's time to step into it. You know what I mean? So we stepped into it. But yeah, that would be a space in which I would say, I was like, dang, this is a real deal.
Good answer.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments before I move on to the next piece? This making sense to you all?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know it's early in the morning. I remember being in college, early classes, I'd be kind of tired sometimes. So the next day, what we did was, the next day was really powerful and moving, because we went to the Canfield Apartments where Michael Brown was, and I use this word specifically, where he was murdered by Darren Wilson, the police officer. And it was a deep experience, because it was so many emotions and feelings. It was traumatic because in the middle of the street you have his memorial, and you see where they essentially put a bunch of gifts because his blood was in the street. And then it was communal, because people were handing out free food and drinks and water and looking out for one another. It was informative, because there were some organizations out there doing Know Your Rights kind of seminars over a microphone, and talking about what your rights are when you get stopped by a police officer. It was disappointing, because you saw the spectacle that it was becoming from media outlets and people who were coming and just kind of taking pictures next to the memorial site and then leaving. You know what I'm saying? It was devastating in the sense of this young man's death is happening in every city across this country. I believe it's every 36 hours, an unarmed African-American man is gunned down by the police department in this country. So devastating in that sense. It was hopeful, though, because there was still a spirit in the air of resistance. And so that brought a hopeful space. So we're able to interact and talk with residents within the Caneville apartments about what happened. We actually had the opportunity to pray with the sister. They were calling her PJ. I think the news was calling her like Paget Williams. They were calling her PJ, but she was the one who actually filmed the video out of her apartment of Darren Wilson walking over Michael Brown's body and walking around, really red-faced, where they said that he had a bloody socket. But when you look at that video, he obviously didn't have that. She shot that particular video. And when we saw her, she was going to dart up into her apartment because she thought that we're media or somebody was probably just trying to exploit her, But a friend of ours that we met out there named Lakeisha, who was another really resilient sister who was there every day in the Caneville apartments watching what was taking place. She actually knew PJ and was a part of this whole piece when PJ had to go to return. All these different things after she filmed this video, the sister Lakeisha was a part of. So Keisha was like, hey, no, they just want to pray for you. We talked with her, we prayed for her, encouraged her. And it was sad to see the fear that was on her face. I was like, man, this is this woman's neighborhood, and this man came and murdered this person right in front of her apartment complex. You know what I'm saying? And so that was a sad kind of moment that we even had to even be there to pray for her. You know what I'm saying? And then there are other folks, there are other like clergy who were kind of there, sadly, who were just kind of parading around and just wanting to be seen. That was another just really disappointing piece. There's one brother who came, he was a clergy, and he was walking with like 3 police officers. It's like, why are you walking with the police in this neighborhood after what happened? Why do you want to be seen with law enforcement in this particular space? But right, so that was a really moving experience. So Ferguson during the day and Ferguson at night were really different. Right, during the day, law enforcement wasn't patrolling the streets. You know what I'm saying? But at night is when the protests jumped off and law enforcement, the National Guard, really rolled in. One of the things that we saw during the day that was just really shocking, again, alluding to the massive military presence, was we were driving looking for something to eat at lunch. We pulled into just a normal shopping center, and the shopping center had been commandeered by the National Guard and turned into a military outpost, right? So that's where they had all their armored vehicles, their weapon caches, they had their buses in case they got to round a bunch of folks off, round a bunch of folks up. And it was shocking. It was shocking because we rolled into this routine. It was shocking because it just showed that any neighborhood can be taken over by either a militarized police force or the military itself and hold citizens captive with fear. And so, I'm still processing that. Like, what is the full extent of what that means? I'm sorry, excuse me. Turn this down. I don't want to get detention. Y'all get detention in college? So that was that was just an experience. And so I think even with this contrast I'm trying to present, something that people have to understand, right? So even before I transition to more some of our activities. So Ferguson isn't a city that deals with a lot of homicides. So Michael Brown's killing was the first killing of the year in Ferguson. So this isn't a community as it's been almost presented as if it's like a gun-toting community or a community where there's a lot of homicide. Even if it was, it wouldn't justify what the police officer did by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a community that doesn't struggle with the issue of gun violence in that particular type of way. It's also a city where I believe that there's been so many search warrants that have been issued by law enforcement. There's basically search warrants that add up to 4 per household in Ferguson, right? 4 per household in Ferguson. This is a city that has been besieged by a police force, right? We talked to people who are like, yeah, when I moved over here, I already knew what the police were like in Ferguson. So it was known what the folks in Ferguson, the police officers in Ferguson were like, right? So this is a neighborhood, a working class neighborhood that doesn't deal with the issue of gun violence, having one of their own gunned down by law enforcement, also already having been harassed on a day-to-day basis by law enforcement, creates an environment where people were, for lack of a better term, people were pissed off, rightfully so, and they took to the streets and protest, right? And so even just again reiterating that these protests outside, when they burned down the Quick Strip was burned down. This was not a riotous atmosphere. This was not Los Angeles in 1992 and other rebellions, I'll use that term, and other rebellions. The vast majority of the protests were peaceful. And so it was not riotous as it was described, right? It was not riotous as it was being described. Which also just kind of brings us to another kind of question of who gets to determine who gets to use violence and when, right? So for many in our country, it's right for law enforcement to be able to use unmitigated, uncontrolled violence, but it's never right for protesters to act violently, which is interesting, in terms of who gets to use violence, right? And so that's kind of a deeper discussion. I believe in nonviolent protests. I don't believe that law enforcement should have unmitigated ability to be violent towards others without expecting some type of reaction from other people, whether violent or otherwise, So citizens who end up using violence in these cases can't be dehumanized because of that, because other folks are using violence too. You know what I'm saying? And so there's that contrast in Ferguson between it being a normally peaceful community versus the tragedy of this killing by Michael Brown. And so the last piece maybe I'll touch on is the last few days I was there basically helping organize some of the young folks in Ferguson from different organizations. And I was really encouraged and inspired by these young folks because these are young folks from different organizations in St. Louis and from other places that came in and who stood up in the face of domination and fear. They kept stepping out there and making their presence felt. There was this one young man that we were protesting with who I share about. His name was Nick. Nick was tear gassed. He got rubber bullets shot at him. He didn't get shot. He was maced. He was dumped in the back of a paddy wagon, left there for about an hour and a half with 10 other people, hauled off to county jail, but was right back out there when he got out to protest. You know what I'm saying? It was that spirit of resilience that I thought was very inspiring and moving. And so to see other organizations, young men and young sisters particularly, it was young sisters who were out there really leading these organizations, you know what I mean, who were on the front lines. It really wasn't it wasn't a lot of the young black men, it was the young sisters who were leading these organizations. And they were resilient. They knew what they wanted. They weren't afraid. They said at the beginning of one of their meetings, they were like, we don't want the clergy out here. You know what I'm saying? And I understood what they were saying. And they ended up kind of saying fully what she meant, but I knew what she meant. But she didn't want clergy. She ended up saying her own mouth that they didn't want clergy dictating the process out here. And they didn't want clergy to do the leading, but they wanted the young people to do the leading. And I thought, I felt it. They didn't want other people coming in and doing that for them. They wanted us to assist and to help, but not to lead, because the leading was theirs. You know what I mean? Because this is their city, this is their community. They're the ones who are the most under duress by law enforcement and oppression by law enforcement. They're the ones who need to lead that. And so that was a deeply inspiring piece that I left Ferguson with, was the resilience of young people and believing that there will be more and more young people to join the movement in this country around putting human dignity at the center of public life. Because it won't happen if young people, young college students like yourselves, high school students don't awaken consciously and deepen their involvement in this country. I mean, every major movement was essentially student-led, you know what I'm saying, in the 20th century, right? You know what I mean? So really, you guys have a really deep part to play in the restoration of this nation. And it's going to be a fight, though, for sure. It's going to be a fight. And so those are some of the reflections that I have with Ferguson, and there's more, but I want to open it up to some questions and comments. Raise that hand high like you, yeah.
Were you out there when the other young man was killed by the police?
So that happened the day before I came, I believe. The day before I came, yeah. When he was gunned down, unarmed again in St. Louis, yeah, it happened the day before I came.
Well, how did you feel about that? Like, what are your thoughts about the whole situation that happened?
With him getting gunned down?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thought that I have about every situation where an unarmed person is being gunned down. Law enforcement's first reaction tends to be when contacting black bodies is violence. you know, and there has to be a mechanism and accountability put in place to where shoot to kill isn't your first interaction. You know what I mean? That, you know, I'm wondering why people aren't shooting beanbags at folks. You know what I mean? Like, why is it that you always have to take a life? You know, and so we do know that this is happening to black folks, and this is not happening to white folks. So it elicited the same kind of emotions around how I felt about Mike Brown or any other situation that happens when an unarmed African American man is killed by law enforcement. You know, it's just in terms of like, it's not like we heard that and then we said, okay, let's go galvanize around that. You know what I mean? It's like the momentum and the movement was around the situation of Mike Brown. You know, unfortunately, it seems like there's just that create when one person is killed by law enforcement, that people galvanize and it raises the consciousness of people and gets people active. In other situations, don't do that, and I'm not fully sure why that's the case. But yeah, my emotions were still the same. Is that a helpful answer?
What do you feel like you accomplished, or did you accomplish anything with the demands that you placed on the prosecutor?
So I don't think with that space that there was something accomplished in the sense of, obviously he didn't recuse himself, right? But there's always something accomplished when you bring people together to get involved democratically, particularly, so from my standpoint, people putting their faith into action and connecting into the civic space. So there was something accomplished in that. And there's always something accomplished in getting that sort of media attention to show that people are indeed active in society and trying to place demands and to do things of restoration. But in terms of long-term accomplishment, that's long-term organizing. And so we knew I knew going in there, like in the 4 days that I was there, that, you know, we weren't going to solve, you know, the situation by any stretch of the imagination. And that wasn't even why I was there. It was just to be able to be a help in any way I can in the process of that. But it's the long-term organizing in Ferguson that is still taking place, and it's long-term organizing in every city. That's where the long-term accomplishments will come from.
I saw something very interesting. I watched this on TV. And one thing I've known about TV over the years is that you got this little screen that you're looking at. And you have no control over what's coming across that screen. So you can get the idea that the whole city is burning. Mm-hmm. That happened in San Diego. They put something in the news during the Civil Rights Act movement, and the building was burning, and it was 2 years ago that building was burned. Okay, not right then. They needed to burn buildings. They stuck it in. The reason why I bring it up is because when I was looking at it, I was wondering why. I was wondering if it was true, and you just answered the question. It seemed like the women had stepped up to the plate, but was that true? And you just said that it was, because that amazed me how involved they were physically when they weren't there they were there, but not out in front of the cameras. Like
so let me make a distinction in terms of what I said. So the sisters were really spearheading a lot of the organizations that were meeting outside of the protest. They were at the protest too,
Okay.
but they were spearheading that. The young men were very active in the protest for sure,
Okay.
and particularly, so I didn't see this myself, but this is what I was told by our folks on the ground prior to our arrival, that the ones who really kept it from being a riotous and looting atmosphere were the young men of the community that stepped up in that space, you know, and were self-policing the neighborhood and making sure that the protests and things like that were not violent. So the young men stepped up in that space. The women that I saw who had really stepped up in terms of doing a lot of organizing and thinking were off the protest and in meetings, you know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Equally valid, you know what I'm saying? But the men were also part of it. They were more so on the protest side during my duration there. You know what I'm saying? So I want to make that clear that, you know, that this might not be an accurate depiction of the entire process of organizing in Ferguson, but just from what I saw and during my time.
So you spoke about, like, you kind of felt like you stepped back into time. Now, with the protests and stuff like that, was there other races there, whites, Mexicans, and if it was, how did they feel about the situation? What was their feelings towards it?
Yeah, so the last night that I was at the protest on a Friday night, there was an increasing number of white protesters that were there. The white clergy that were there, there was a few of them that came to protest too, but the nights that I was there, where we met with. I'm not sure actually where they ended up going. I think some of them stayed behind at St. Mark's in case the police came and they were offering themselves to be arrested. But some of the white clergy didn't all come out to protest, you know what I'm saying? But there were young white activists who were out there protesting as well. I didn't see as many Latino sisters and brothers, and I think some of that might be due to the demographics of St. Louis, you know what I'm saying, which is kind of mostly white and black, you know. But there were some white sisters and brothers out there protesting, and I'm unsure the demographic of the first, when the protests really jumped off, but that was primarily black folks. That was primarily the people of Ferguson in the very beginning, before people started coming in for support and stuff like that.
Did you hear anything about them, the white activists, getting treated the same as black ones, or?
Yeah. So what I did hear, I didn't hear anything about necessarily a white activist like kind of being treated better per se. I did hear this from one of our national directors, is that there were white anarchists who were there in the protest who were intentionally trying to rile up black protesters. And so this came from a Cambodian brother who was like, I watched, you know, them trying to hand Molotov cocktails to protesters, white anarchists who came in. You know what I'm saying? So he said he saw that out of his own eyes, you know. So I did see that. And then, you know, inevitably, there were, you know, Asian provocateurs, you know what I'm saying, in the protests, you know what I'm saying, trying to rile folks up and things of that nature. Rile them up in a way that would be unproductive.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there's been a history of that, and it's often not discussed. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is an Asian provocateur is someone who will come into a movement and intentionally create conflict or division to quell the movement progressing and gaining power and authority. And so in a situation like this, it would be someone, now I'm not saying that the anarchist was an Asian provocateur on behalf of like the federal government per se. I'm not sure what this person who necessarily worked for, but an Asian provocateur might work for a federal government agency like the FBI or like a local police department that wants to disrupt local politics of protest. You know what I'm saying? And so, so someone who is handing someone Molotov cocktails to throw wants to bring a situation of violence because they want it to be depicted as if the protesters are violent. So that shapes the national imagination. Protesters are violent, therefore violent force and domination is necessary and warranted. You know what I mean? So Asian provocateur might want to do something like that to create disruption and that will work in favor of the powerful forces, whether that again is the FBI, local law enforcement, or what have you. And so, yeah. And so, you know, I'm not saying that I saw someone and said, hey, he's an Asian provocateur, you know what I'm saying? But I know that they were in the crowd because they get dispatched in these situations. And they've been a part of the civil rights movement. They've been a part of the Black Panther movement where they've been folks that infiltrated and have caused terrible actions. If I'm correct, one of the major photographers of the civil rights movement, didn't it come out that he worked for the FBI?
Which one are you referring to?
I'm not sure which one, but I read an article maybe just a couple of years ago, one that passed away. And do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, he was real close to Martin Luther King.
Right.
I don't remember his name, but it was revealed after his death that he was, there he is right there, coding himself up.
Yeah.
Well, this is not him. This is
Yeah, that's the organization.
This is a program initiated by J. Edgar Hoover, who was then head of the FBI in the 60s and 70s. And the goal of the program was to undermine these kinds of activities and organizations. So everything from organizations relevant to the civil rights movement to the Black Power generation, like the Black Panthers, they would send in people to purposely disrupt these programs. They would send miscommunications between the leadership to kind of instill disunity. And the purpose of it was to break it down. So in that, and you got to keep this in context, J. Edgar Hoover said that the biggest fear he had was that there would be what he referred to as a black messiah that would come out of these organizations. What he was basically saying is he was deathly afraid that these organizations would institute a protest on such a mass level and bring together populations that over time had not associated. So poor folks, black folk, poor Latinos, immigrants, all these groups, the potential of them organizing and actually saying we have the same problem, and then beginning to look at the same group of people instituting those problems. That was what he was most afraid of. So this program came about to kind of instill that kind of disruption to prevent people from coming together. So when he talks about agent provocateurs coming in, there is a history of that. That's not something he's making up. This is an instituted program by the U.S. government and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And we'll be talking about it later in the semester, but I just wanted to put that in context. This is not just, paranoia falling out of the sky. This is happening.
And even to bring it to the hip hop generation, I'm not sure if you read this book, Dr. Johnson. It's called The FBI's War on Tupac Shakur and Other Black Leaders. As a guy from Columbia named John Potash, and in the book he actually talks about the COINTELPRO program and how essentially the supposed beef between Tupac and Biggie, the supposed East Coast West Coast beef, the same tactics that created that beef were used in the Black Panther movement and stuff like that to divide leaders. And so he actually takes and says the same tactics that were used in these folks were used in hip hop to divide folks and pit people against each other who actually didn't have any problems. It's actually it's a fascinating book, but it deals with this history of FBI infiltration in movement. But all in all, I thought it was an experience I'll never forget. When I came back to Fresno is when I realized more that I felt like I was in a foreign country, an occupied land, as I was coming back. And then it just has encouraged me further to deepen my work, particularly in the area around the brutality of local law enforcement. So Fresno, just really briefly, we were saying Fresno is Ferguson when we had a day of solidarity at Fresno City College a couple of weeks ago. And what we mean by that is that Fresno's Ferguson in the sense that black and brown lives should be valued here just like they're valued in other cities. Fresno's Ferguson because Fresno also has a militarized police force. Fresno PD rolled a tank down Strada Avenue last year in response to certain threats against law enforcement. Police departments get military-grade equipment from the federal government and are told that they have to use them at least once within the first year. They have to give them back. So the government gives local police departments military-grade weaponry and tells them to use it. So, it's the militarization of the police department, and that happens here. That has happened here in Fresno. And in that sense, Fresno's Ferguson. And
They have the Mike Browns here too. When I got here, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I remember when I first got here 7 years ago, there was a protest going on for an African-American male who was killed by a police officer. So you can research that. But very quickly, one of the things I wanted to add just about this moment is, and especially in classes, we talk about history as if it's just this faraway thing, right? History, the civil rights movement, the March on Washington, these kind of moments, and you see thousands of pictures, but most of the time, the people that were involved in those movements who were often your age, they didn't know it was going to be extant time as history. They were just, responding to things at the time. Nobody in Ferguson imagined, especially before Mike's death, and probably while it was happening, that was going to be the next moment where this, this kind of level thing would happen. But at the end of the day, history is happening every day. And if you're not involved in it in some way, shape, or form, if you're not even aware of it, I want you to critically reevaluate what you're doing. Because it's not something that just happened in 1963. It never stopped happening. It's always happening. And if you're going to be looking at events that are happening in the world now the same way you do something that happened 30, 40 years ago, why are you not injected into something? You need to be involved in something. The issues going on today are the same issues that were going on 50 years ago. It hasn't changed in some respects, and in some respects it's gotten worse. So if you're just looking at it from the outside, I want you to reevaluate that and ask yourself why. So when your grandkids ask you, wow, what happened in Ferguson? Were you involved? Were you? Did you have anything to say about it? What about if it happens right down the street? Are you going to be involved in that? Or is that too going to be treated like something far away? I want you to find the issues that matter to you and inject yourself in them. Life is short, and this stuff that's happening is not far away. It's happening right here. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want
No,
to add
no,
that
no.
real quick. Any other questions for our guest?
Oh, he already had a question, so we'll go you, then we'll go.
What can we do like to end police brutality on blacks like besides protests? I mean, 'cause, like I'm originally from Oakland, so I was in the area where they had where I used to grant jobs.